The house was not built upon earth. It was built upon hunger. Behind lace curtains that fluttered without wind and iron gates that moaned like old throats in prayer, the plantation rose like a mausoleum too proud to admit it was a tomb. By day it shimmered with whitewashed walls, a crown of columns and fields spread out like a kingdom. By night, when the cicadas fell silent, the timbers groaned, and the soil beneath whispered of every back broken to lay its bricks. The kitchen was its heart, and the heart never slept. Fire roared there in iron-bellied stoves, flames licking the soot-black ceiling as if trying to escape. The air was thick with the perfume of roasted meats, stews, and sweetbreads that masked something fouler, the copper tang of blood that clung to the stones no matter how many buckets of water were thrown. Every meal carried weight. Every plate, when set before the masters, seemed to tremble with secrets not meant to be consumed. The house fed them, and the house demanded payment. Servants whispered that the mortar between the bricks was mixed with more than lime and clay. Chains had been buried beneath the foundation, lengths of iron shackles locked around nothing, as though invisible wrists still wore them. And each clink, each midnight groan from beneath the floorboards, was not the sound of the house settling, but of the buried chains shifting in their eternal unrest. "Don't stare too long," an elder cook once warned the younger ones, her eyes sharp as broken glass. "This house sees, and when it sees you, it eats you." They thought her words old superstition, a way to frighten children into obedience. Yet when one girl vanished after carrying the bones from the kitchen to the pit, gone without scream, without struggle, apron folded neatly by the door, no one laughed again. The masters dined with laughter loud enough to drown out the unease. Their voices rang high, their goblets clinked, and their forks scraped porcelain like knives on bone. But sometimes between bites they paused. Their eyes darted to corners where shadows gathered thicker than they should, to doorways where no one stood, to the blackened mouth of the chimney that breathed like a sleeping beast. The house listened. The house remembered. At night, when the last plates were scrubbed and the hearth dimmed, the kitchen did not cool. Coals glowed on their own, embers breathing without breath. The long wooden table, scarred by knives and stained with wine, bore the faint marks of fingernails dragged across its grain, some deep enough to have drawn blood. And if one pressed an ear against it, they swore they could hear whispers pulsing through the wood, as if chains dragged along an unseen corridor. Always circling, never resting, the overseer, a man with hands like iron tongs, scoffed when told of such things, yet even he did not step inside the kitchen after midnight. He claimed it was rats that made the noises, but his voice cracked whenever he said it. The truth was older, darker, unspoken. Long before the house was raised, the land had been a place of gathering, of songs sung under open sky. Spirits were fed here with offerings of corn, smoke, and prayer. But when the first stones were laid, when the chains were hammered into soil as anchors, the old songs fell silent. What was bound in iron twisted. What was denied its rest grew sharp with hunger, and hunger does not fade, it waits. Sometimes, in the earliest hours of dawn, a servant girl would find scraps of food missing though no one had entered. Half-bitten bread, gnawed bones, bowls licked clean though no hand had touched them, and though no dogs roamed the grounds, paw prints marked with claw and ash trailed across the hearth. "They eat with us," whispered Violet one night, her voice low, her gaze steady as the iron pot she stirred. She was young then, her eyes burning darker than night. "Not beside us. Inside us." No one asked her what she meant, because none wanted to hear the answer. The house was a mouth, and every clink of chain was its chewing. It fed on sweat, on labor, on breath, but the kitchen gave it more. Each meal became an offering. Each swallow bound the living to the house as surely as the dead were bound beneath it. And though the masters believed themselves fed by the hands of slaves, it was the house itself that fed upon them all. One evening, as twilight bled across the fields, the mistress of the house complained of a taste in her stew. "Bitter," she hissed, setting the spoon down with a sharp clink. The cook trembled, apologizing, though the recipe had not changed in years. Yet the bitterness remained, coating the tongue like ash, thickening in the throat like dust from a grave. That night, the mistress did not sleep. She wandered the halls, pressing her hands to her stomach, groaning softly. Servants swore they heard the rattling of chains following behind her, faint but insistent. By morning she was found seated at the kitchen table, eyes open, spoon still in her hand. Her body cold, The chains beneath the floor rattled louder that day. No priest would bless the kitchen after that. No bell tolled when she was buried. And though her chair was pushed in and her name was whispered in prayer, the house had swallowed her whole. It was then the servants began to fear not just the masters, but the house itself. They spoke of it in hushed voices, careful never to let the walls hear. For if the house fed on chains, it fed also on silence, and silence was plentiful. Yet Violet did not fear. She walked the halls as though she belonged to the house, as though she heard its whispers and answered them in kind. Her hands, quiet and sure, stirred the pots with herbs that no one recognized, herbs that smoked when crushed and left the air sharp with unseen breath. The house leaned toward her, its beams groaning low like a beast sniffing its master, and though no one yet knew it, the feast to come had already begun. They called her Violet, though no one remembered who gave her the name. Perhaps it was the midwife who swore her eyes were too dark for a child, darker than the midnight river. Perhaps it was the old crone in the quarters, who whispered that such eyes should never be met too long. For they were not simply looking at you, they were looking through you. Violet grew like a shadow at the edges of firelight, small and silent, yet always there. Her hands never trembled, not when carrying iron pots too heavy for her frame, not when gutting chickens, not even when the overseer's whip cracked in the air nearby. She worked as though her flesh were not her own, as though something steadier moved her bones and her hands were quiet, too quiet. Others fumbled, spilled, coughed and cursed their clumsiness, but Violet's fingers glided. Bread dough bent beneath her touch like it wanted to obey. Herbs broke apart without sound, releasing their bitter perfumes into the air like secrets sighing free. When she served food, the spoons made no scrape against porcelain, the ladles no clatter in the pot. Even the floorboards beneath her steps seemed to hush, as though they did not dare creak against her weight. "Child moves like she ain't born," muttered the elder cook one night, wiping sweat from her brow. Like she was Maid, others nodded but did not speak, for Violet was near, and when Violet was near, words turned to ashes in the throat. Her gaze was worse. Those who caught it for more than a heartbeat swore they felt a stirring beneath their skin, a ripple, as if something in them shifted that was not their own will. One boy swore his tongue moved against his teeth, though he had not meant to speak. Another girl claimed her heartbeat skipped to the rhythm of Violet's blinking. Most turned their eyes away quickly, though some, and the bold or the foolish, tried to hold her stare. None succeeded. Even the masters felt it, though they would never admit it. The mistress avoided Violet's gaze, her smile trembling whenever the girl's shadow passed. The master, harder and prouder, once fixed Violet with a glare across the kitchen demanding she look away. She did not. He lasted 3 breaths before his hand trembled on his glass, spilling wine across his lap. He cursed her, but he never met her eyes again. Violet said little. When she did, her words fell like stones in a pond, ripples spreading long after the sound was gone. Her voice was not harsh, not even commanding. It was low, calm, steady. The voice of someone who had already decided, and who knew you would follow whether you wished it or not. One evening, while the cooks murmured over pots of stew, Violet pressed leaves between her palms, crushing them into a powder so fine it clung to her fingertips. She whispered as she worked, not prayers. Not hymns, names not written in any holy book. Names the others did not know yet felt in their bones, as if they had been buried deep in their marrow since birth. The elder cook crossed herself, though she did not know which god she was warding against. "What you saying, girl?" she asked. Violet looked up, eyes catching the firelight like oil on water. Her lips parted, but the words that came did not belong to the room. They bent the air, thickened the smoke, and left the others dizzy. By the time she fell silent, no one could recall what she had spoken, only that their hands shook and their ears rang as though a bell had tolled within their skulls. From that night on, none questioned what Violet placed in the pots. The chains beneath the floor seemed to echo her presence. They clinked when she passed, faintly, like dogs stirring at the scent of their master. At times the coals in the hearth flared without being stoked, as though breath unseen had leaned in close, and Violet, with her quiet hands, stirred as though she were not feeding men at all, but something else. Whispers spread in the quarters. Some said she was marked. Others said she was chosen. A few swore she was no girl at all, but a vessel, a door through which something older looked upon them. One woman, too bold for her own good, cornered Violet near the water barrel. "What are you, child?" she demanded, voice sharp with fear. Violet did not answer. She dipped her hands into the water, lifting them slow. Droplets clung to her skin like jewels, refusing to fall. When she raised her eyes, the woman staggered back, clutching her chest. "You ain't right," she hissed. "Ain't no child can look like that." Violet smiled then, small and cold. "Maybe I ain't a child," she said. The woman did not speak to her again. As weeks bled into months, Violet grew not in body. She stayed slight, almost fragile, but in presence. Rooms grew still when she entered. Lamps flickered, chains beneath the floor rattled. Shadows along the wall seemed to bend toward her. And the house, that hungry house, seemed to lean closer, as if listening for her next whisper. On a night heavy with storm, when thunder rolled like drums of war, and the masters dined on roasted lamb, Violet passed among them with her quiet hands. No plate clinked, no spoon scraped, yet when the master lifted his knife, the blade trembled as though gripped by another hand. He paused. His face paled. His eyes darted to Violet, who stood at the far end of the table, silent, watching. The thunder cracked again, shaking the windows. The chandelier above shuddered, its crystals chiming like tiny bells. And in that brief flicker of lightning, the master swore, though he never told a soul, that Violet's shadow moved though she did not. When he looked again, her hands were folded neatly in her apron. But her eyes were burning darker than night, and in their depths he felt something stir beneath his skin. The kitchen breathed like a living thing, thick with smoke, sweat, and secrets. Every pot simmered as though it hid not broth but confessions, each bubbling surface reflecting flickers of firelight that looked too much like eyes. The air was heavy with roasted meats and fresh bread, but beneath the warmth lingered something sharper, the bite of crushed leaves, roots ground into powder, seeds that burned the tongue before they healed or destroyed. It was Violet who tended them, her quiet hands moving with precision that no one dared interrupt. She gathered herbs others overlooked, bitter stalks from the edge of the fields, weeds that grew where no sunlight reached, blossoms that opened only at night. She pressed them in her palms, whispered over them, and dropped them into stews where they dissolved like ink into water. At first, the other cooks believed she seasoned only for taste, but when the mistress's cough eased after a sip of broth, when the master's rage softened into a strange daze after his wine was poured, they began to watch more carefully. What they saw frightened them, for Violet did not bless her herbs with the sign of the cross, nor with prayers the chapel would know. She whispered names instead, syllables not meant for the human throat, phrases that bent the air around her mouth until smoke curled in unnatural shapes. "Child," the elder cook whispered one night, trembling as she watched Violet grind leaves into dust. "Them words ain't holy." Violet did not look up. "Holy," she murmured, "is what keeps chains tight." The elder cook flinched, her spoon slipping from her hand into the pot. The broth hissed, steam rising like a spirit startled awake. She made no reply, for Violet's eyes were on her now, and in those eyes the old woman felt the chains beneath the house rattling, restless, eager. From then on, the others worked in silence. Violet's herbs grew stranger with each passing day. She lined jars along the shelves, filled with dried roots, powders, and petals, each labeled not with words but with marks, spirals, slashes, crooked shapes like broken stars. She touched them with reverence, as if each jar contained not ingredients but voices waiting to be heard. When she cooked, she whispered names not found in any book, not even in memory. They seemed older than language itself, and though no one understood them, the sound alone made sweat bead on brows and skin prickle with unease. One boy swore he heard the chains under the floor echo those names. Each clink seemed to answer her. Each groan of the beams above seemed to lean closer, yet the masters never noticed. They ate with greedy mouths, laughing loud, drinking deep. They praised the flavor, saying it was richer, fuller, unlike any they had tasted before. They did not see how their servants averted their eyes, how hands trembled as plates were set, how shadows thickened along the walls as Violet whispered over the food. The house noticed. Its timbers sighed when she stirred the pots, sighs that rose through the rafters like breath escaping a coffin. The hearth flared when she dropped herbs into the flame, sparks leaping higher than wood alone could give. At night, when the kitchen should have slept, the shelves rattled softly. as though the jars themselves murmured with unseen tongues. One evening, when the others had gone, Violet remained alone by the hearth. She crushed a handful of bitter leaves into a bowl, her hands steady, her lips moving. The air thickened, pressing against the walls. Shadows crawled across the ceiling like black water. A whisper rose from beneath the floor, faint but certain. A chain dragged slow, metal grinding against stone. Violet did not flinch. She whispered louder. The sound grew, chains clinking in rhythm with her words, until it seemed the entire house was bound in their rattling. Then, with a final word, a word that cracked like a whip, she dropped the herbs into the fire. The flames hissed, flared green, then sank into a deep red glow. In the silence that followed, Violet bowed her head. Her lips moved once more, but no sound escaped. It was a silent prayer, offered not to heaven but to whatever pressed close in the darkness, and in that silence something answered. A gust of air swept through the kitchen, though no door had opened. The jars rattled violently, one shattering against the stone floor. From its shards spilled not dried herbs, but something wet, black and writhing, which hissed before sinking into the cracks. Violet only smiled, her quiet hands brushing the shards aside as if sweeping crumbs. By dawn, the kitchen smelled of bread and roasted meats again, but beneath it lingered the bitterness of herbs no tongue could name. The others said nothing, though their eyes darted often to Violet, to the way her shadow stretched too long across the floor, to the way chains beneath the house now clinked in time with her breath. And when the masters sat to dine that night, lifting spoons and knives with greedy hands, they did not know what passed their lips was no longer food alone. They were swallowing whispers, swallowing names, swallowing prayers meant not for them but for the house. The chains beneath the floor shuddered in delight, and Violet stirred her pot, lips moving, eyes burning darker than night. The feast began with laughter. Candles dripped their wax like slow tears, casting golden light across polished silver and porcelain plates. The dining hall was a cathedral of appetite, its ceilings high, its windows veiled in heavy drapes, its long table stretched like an altar where the masters fed not only their hunger but their pride. Glasses clinked in rhythm with stories told too loudly, their voices rising over one another until the air itself felt swollen with sound. But beneath that laughter, something else swelled. The food was rich, abundant, gleaming with butter and spice. Stews simmered dark and fragrant. Meats roasted to glistening perfection. Loaves of bread warm enough to steam in the hand. To the masters it was a banquet of triumph. Proof that their house prospered. That their chains bound not only bodies but the very earth to their command. Yet to those who served, the feast felt wrong. Every plate carried a weight too heavy for porcelain. Every bite seemed to thicken the air. The servants' hands trembled as they poured wine, though they masked it with practiced bows. The candles sputtered often, as though the air itself grew too dense to carry flame. And Violet, quiet Violet, moved among them like a shadow in plain sight. Her hands poured, her gaze lingered, her lips whispered beneath her breath. Few noticed her murmurs over the bowls and platters, but those who did felt their skin prickle as though the prayers were not blessings but bindings. "Child," one servant hissed when she passed, too low for the masters to hear, "what have you done to the food?" Violet's eyes flicked to her, burning darker than the wine. "I only gave it what it was missing." The woman recoiled, saying no more. As the feast swelled, the masters grew louder, their laughter booming like drums before a flood. They raised their glasses, boasting of the harvest, of the ships that would carry their wealth, of the obedience that chained every hand that had served this meal. They praised the richness of the broth, the sweetness of the bread, the tenderness of the meat. None of them noticed the taste had changed. Not at first, it was subtle, a faint bitterness beneath the sweetness, a sharp note at the back of the tongue, like the taste of iron after biting the lip. But with each bite the bitterness deepened. It clung to their throats, coating them in dust that no wine could wash away. The servants shifted uneasily. They too smelled it now, a faint acrid tang that had not been there when the pots boiled in the kitchen, a smell like burnt herbs, like earth overturned on a grave. Yet the masters did not stop eating. Their hunger blinded them. Their pride drowned them. The laughter continued, though it rang thinner now, strained by the heaviness pressing into their throats. One man cleared his throat again and again, his face reddening, but still he reached for more bread. Another woman sipped wine constantly, yet the dryness in her mouth only grew. The air itself seemed to change. The candlelight dimmed, flickering as though shadows leaned closer. The air thickened, making each breath drag like cloth pulled through water. The rattling of chains beneath the floor grew louder, faint at first, then steady, then insistent, until the entire hall seemed to pulse with their rhythm. A servant boy dropped a platter. The crash rang sharp through the hall, yet none of the masters scolded him. Their eyes were fixed elsewhere, unfocused, hazy, blinking slow as though something heavy pressed behind their lids. One by one, forks stilled. Knives lay forgotten. Hands clutched at throats, at stomachs, at the air itself as though to pull it inside. Yet Violet stood calm, her quiet hands folded in her apron, her gaze sweeping the table like a priestess, surveying her congregation. A murmur rose from her lips, low and steady. The words were not meant for human ears, yet they rippled through the hall, tightening the chains beneath the floor, making the very walls groan in answer. The masters shifted uneasily, some glancing at her with sudden recognition. Too late. For their throats were already heavy, their tongues thick, their bodies trapped between hunger and dread. The feast had changed. What had begun as food was no longer food. It was prayer. It was offering. It was binding, and though they did not yet know it, they were not the ones feasting. They were the feast. The candles guttered low, their flames bending as though drawn toward Violet. The chains beneath the house rattled faster, faster until they seemed to sing, and Violet whispered louder, her eyes burning darker than night as the first spoon clattered from a hand gone limp. The laughter died first. It did not fade gently but snapped as though a string had been cut. One moment the dining hall rang with drunken mirth, with goblets clinking and voices raised in boast and story. The next, silence coiled itself around the room like a serpent, broken only by the scrape of a chair and the harsh rattle of breath that refused to flow. The first to fall was a man swollen with pride and wine, his waistcoat straining against a belly grown fat from years of feasts. He lifted his spoon again and again, though his lips no longer obeyed, though his tongue felt thick as clay. His throat tightened, clamped, and no swallow would come. He clawed at his neck, eyes bulging, skin turning the purple of ripened figs. The veins stood out along his temples as he choked on nothing. No bone lodged, no food misswallowed, but an invisible hand gripping his windpipe. His goblet spilled, red wine streaming across the tablecloth like fresh blood. "Mercy," he gasped, though no mercy came. The servants froze, bowls in hand, their faces pale as plaster. None dared move, for Violet was watching. She did not rush to aid him. She did not cry out. She did not even blink. Her quiet hand stirred an invisible spoon in the air, steady, calm, as though guiding the rhythm of his suffering. Her lips did not part, yet her eyes spoke. This is not accident. The others at the table rose to their feet, chairs scraping harshly, their voices shouting for water, for help, for air. But the hall answered only with the rattling of chains beneath the floorboards. Louder now, insistent as though rejoicing, the man staggered, his hands tearing at his collar, and collapsed across the table. Plates shattered beneath him, bones snapping under his weight. His face struck the porcelain with a dull thud, and his body spasmed once, twice, then lay still. No one moved to lift him. The mistress at his side shrieked, but her cry caught, breaking into coughs. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her throat working desperately, but the same unseen grip held her fast. She gagged, her face contorting, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Help her," someone cried. But who could help when their own throats burned, their own tongues felt swollen, their own gulps dragged like stones down a dry well? The air was heavy. It clung to their mouths, dry and thick, as though they breathed in dust. Every breath rasped louder, filling the silence with the music of suffocation. And Violet, quiet, patient Violet, only stirred. The servants backed into the shadows, some covering their mouths as if to hold in screams, others pressing their hands to their ears to block out the sound of chains rattling ever faster beneath the floor. One young girl whispered, trembling, "She's feeding it." No one asked what she meant. They all knew. The mistress fell to her knees, her silk gown pooling like spilled milk across the floor. Her hands beat at her chest, desperate, futile. Her lips moved soundlessly, praying perhaps or cursing, but no voice came. She toppled, her body shaking violently before going limp. The others stared in horror, their forks and knives lying forgotten in pools of wine and broth. They tried to rise, to flee, but their legs felt heavy, their heads clouded, as though the very air was a chain binding them to the table. One man slammed his fist against the wall, his face crimson, veins bulging at his neck. His mouth opened wide, but only a wheeze emerged. He sank to the floor, twitching like a marionette with cut strings. Violet's eyes followed him, unblinking, dark as the river's depth. The house leaned closer. The rafters groaned as though bowing to her. The candles flared and dimmed, their flames bending inward. The chains beneath the floor dragged and clattered, faster now as though circling in a frenzy of hunger. Still, Violet stirred her invisible spoon. Still, her lips whispered prayers meant not for heaven, but for the house, for the chains, for the restless dead bound in iron. The feast was over. What had begun in triumph ended in silence, broken only by choking gasps, by chairs overturned, by the scrape of nails against wood, as the masters clawed for relief that never came. And as the last voice faltered, as the last goblet rolled across the table to spill its blood-dark wine across the floor, Violet stood still and cold, her quiet hands folded in her apron. She did not speak. She did not smile. She only stared into the fire, her eyes burning darker than night, as the house swallowed another breath. The night of the burials arrived beneath a bruised sky, swollen with clouds that threatened but never broke. The air carried the stench of wax, of sweat, of something sourer, as if the very soil had curdled from what it was forced to hold. Coffins lined the churchyard like a procession of mute sentinels, each one hammered shut with trembling hands, each one refusing to yield even the faintest echo. When lowered into the waiting earth, the masters had demanded a proper service, a display of their dignity in death, as though dignity could cleanse the rot that seeped from their bodies. They had ordered the bells to toll, for the French quarter to hear their departure, for the city to bow its head. Yet when the ropes were pulled, the iron mouths gaped silently. No clang, no cry, no reverberation through the streets. Only the ropes creak, dry and rasping, as though the bells themselves had turned to bone. Whispers coiled quickly through the mourners. The bell tower was not broken. The clappers were whole. The ropes, though frayed from age, were strong enough to bite into flesh. Still nothing came. Some claimed they felt the ground throb beneath their feet, as though the sound had been swallowed before it could be born. Others swore they heard the faintest murmur, not a bell's song, but something like a moan. Pressed down deep into the earth, the priest crossed himself again and again, lips trembling as he recited words that dissolved into the night air like breath on glass. His voice faltered when he reached the verses of resurrection, for resurrection seemed mockery when none dared to open the coffins. No one wanted to look inside. No one wanted to risk confirming what gnawed at their marrow, that death was not settled, that rest was not given. And through it all, Violet lingered at the edge of the gathering. Her face half shadowed beneath a kerchief, her eyes lowered, her hands folded as though in prayer. But those who dared glimpse her mouth swore her lips moved in a rhythm out of step with the priest's, a private liturgy. A darker recitation. The widows clutched rosaries until their fingers bled. Children hid their faces in their mothers' skirts, begging to be taken home. The overseers muttered curses under their breath, anger rising not at their fear, but at the thought of spectacle denied. For in silence, the power of their masters seemed smaller, their departure a withering instead of a triumph. At last, in desperation, the sexton climbed the tower to strike the bell with his own hands. A crowd gathered below, necks craning upward, hearts begging for a single note to split the suffocating quiet. He raised the hammer. He brought it down. The iron bell shuddered with the force, vibrating visibly in the lantern light. Yet no sound spilled forth. Only dust rained down, bitter and fine, clinging to the faces of those below. The silence became unbearable, a weight pressing upon skulls until some moaned aloud, just to remind themselves their throats could still give voice. Then, from far away, carried faint on the Mississippi's breath, came a low resonance, not from the church, not from the tower, but from somewhere beneath the river's skin, a tolling deeper than any bell, slow and mournful, as if the water itself had been struck. 1, 2, 3. The sound rolled through the quarter, heavy as chains dragged across stone. Mothers pressed their children tighter. The priest dropped his book. The master's coffins seemed to shiver where they lay in the earth, as though answering the call. Violet did not flinch. She raised her head at last, eyes glistening with a darkness no candle could pierce, and she smiled, not cruelly, not kindly, but with the serenity of one who had long awaited this silence, this refusal, this hollowing of the old order. When the final coffin was lowered, the ground refused to take it quietly. The soil shifted, trembling like the hide of some great animal beneath a whip. The hole gaped wider, swallowing faster, until the earth itself seemed to hunger. Men scrambled, shovels flashing, voices breaking, but the earth wanted what it was owed. The coffin slid into the moor of dirt, and the ground closed around it with a shudder that rattled teeth. Above, the tower bells hung lifeless, their mouths open in mute defiance. Below, the river's tolling faded into the night, replaced by the slow rise of frog song and cicada hiss, the music of swamps, not sanctuaries. And when the mourners dispersed, no one dared glance back at the church. No one dared look to the kitchen windows, where some swore a single flame burned though no hand had lit it. For in silence, Violet had spoken louder than any bell. The river did not sleep that night. Its waters, usually sluggish and brown, churned with a blackness that seemed thicker than liquid, as if oil and night had mingled, spilling a secret into its depths. The Mississippi had always been called a graveyard, swallowing men, beasts, and ships alike. But on this night, the river itself seemed restless, swollen with whispers carried on its tide. Lanterns bobbed along the levee where the mourners had fled, though few dared to linger. They crossed themselves and muttered that the river was speaking, its current dragging syllables from unseen mouths. Some swore they heard the clinking of chains beneath the surface, pulled taut and then released again, as if someone far below still struggled, still refused to surrender. The air was heavy with the stink of rot. Not fish, not the usual decay of marsh and riverbank, but something human, raw, like meat left to fester. Dogs barked until their voices cracked. The birds that usually clattered through the night cypress had fled hours before, leaving only an oppressive silence between the river's murmurs. It was there, at the edge of that vast breathing water, that shadows began to gather. At first, they seemed no more than reeds bending against the current, swaying unnaturally in the absence of wind. But as the moon slid between clouds, the shapes sharpened. Long silhouettes bent at odd angles, standing waist-deep in water where no man could stand without sinking. Fishermen, watching from the bank, dropped their nets, retreating, as if the very sight could stain them. One whispered, voice cracking, "Those are not men. Those are the ones she's taken." Violet's name was not spoken aloud, but it was present in every shallow breath, in every sidelong glance cast toward the trees. The shadows did not move with the current, nor against it. They held their place unmoored yet steady, watching the shore with patience that belonged to neither the living nor the drowned. A child, too young to know better, slipped from his mother's grasp and toddled toward the water, reaching out as if to greet them. His hand stretched wide, small fingers curling toward the darkness. The mother's scream tore through the night, and she lunged forward, clutching him just as the first ripple broke. Something pale and bloated rose just enough to touch the surface, a hand long-nailed and swollen with river water. It sank again before anyone else could see, but the boy's wailing did not stop until sunrise. The river took on a rhythm after that, like a drumbeat beneath the skin of the world. Boom, 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 slow, steady, almost like a bell, but heavier as though struck with something too vast to be seen. Each vibration carried across the water, shaking shutters, loosening glass panes, making horses rear and flee in blind terror, and those who dared stand their ground swore they saw her. Not Violet herself, not her body, but her reflection. In water, where no face should have been, her features shimmered, eyes like unlit coals, lips curved in a silence that mocked the bells which would not ring. She smiled faintly, as though the river itself had become her mirror, her dominion. No one knew how long they watched. Time became liquid, minutes stretching thin, hours collapsing inward. But when dawn finally pushed its grey hand across the horizon, the shadows had melted back into the current. The river stilled, though its color remained darker, thick as ink. Yet the levee was not empty. Across the wet mud, barefoot prints trailed in winding patterns, some small as children's, some wide and deep like a man's, others clawed as if left by no human foot at all. They led away from the water, up toward the plantation road, vanishing where the cypress trees closed in like black jaws. And though the prints ended, the whispers did not. They clung to the air, breathed into every ear bold enough to linger, follow. The Mississippi swallowed the rest, dragging its secrets deeper, darker, until even the bravest knew the truth. The river had given Violet her army, and their shadows would never leave its edge. The great dining hall of the plantation stood ablaze with candlelight, though the flames burned low and sickly, their glow more orange than gold, as though fed not by wax, but by marrow. The master had summoned what remained of his household, insisting that death itself could be tamed by ritual, that dignity could banish fear. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his chair higher, his gaze sharpened with a kind of desperate command. The silverware gleamed. The porcelain plates were set with trembling precision. Servants moved like phantoms, their footsteps hushed, their eyes fixed on the floorboards. Outside, the river's whispers pressed against the shutters. Inside, the air reeked of cloves, of roasted meat, of wine poured too heavily, as though drowning thirst could disguise the bitter undertow. The master raised his glass first. His hand shook, but his voice did not. "You see," he declared, lips pale and cracked, "we feast and we remain. Whatever spell that girl thought to weave, whatever trick she thought to play, we will endure." The guests forced their laughter, hollow and brittle, their throats dry. They ate with slow mechanical motions, as if chewing required more will than they possessed. The meat was tender, the bread soft, yet every bite lingered too long on the tongue, carrying with it a heaviness that pulled the stomach downward. Violet was not there. Yet she was everywhere. Her absence filled the hall like smoke, pressing against the lungs. Some swore they saw her shadow flicker in the corners, where candlelight faltered. Others felt her presence in the food itself, as though her hands had lingered on each loaf, each bottle, each carved slice of flesh. The master drank deeply. Wine spilled from the corners of his mouth, trailing down his chin like blood. He laughed louder than before, daring the silence to answer him. "You hear me, girl? You think your whispers can unmake me. I am the one who feeds, I am the one who takes." But as the liquid touched his throat, his laughter choked into stillness. He froze, eyes widening, the goblet suspended in his grasp. For what filled his mouth was not wine, but something thicker, metallic, coating his tongue with the weight of years. He gagged, coughed, and slammed the goblet down. But the taste remained. Not grapes, not sweetness, but ash and iron. The others stared as his face drained of color. He gasped, retching, clawing at his chest. Then one by one the others followed. A woman shrieked, shoving away her plate as bile rose from her belly. Another man wept openly, hands trembling as he tasted sins he had long buried, each drop of wine carrying the flavor of his cruelties, each morsel of bread swelling his throat with guilt he had thought forgotten. The master fell to his knees, vomiting onto the stone floor. Yet no food came forth, only darkness thick as tar, spilling from his lips in ropes. It stank of burned flesh, of salt tears, of every lash that had struck under his command. The room reeled with it. Guests stumbled back, gagging, covering their mouths, though they could not escape. The master lifted his head, eyes rolling, his voice broken. It is me she has poured into this cup." His hands shook violently, knocking the goblet aside. It clattered, spilling its remaining contents across the tablecloth. The liquid shimmered but not red, black, glistening like oil, reflecting not candlelight but faces, twisted and contorted, staring back in judgment. The servants did not move. They did not cry out. They watched in silence, their breaths shallow, their gazes steady. Some might have been smiling. The master collapsed, his body heaving, his mouth opening again. What poured from him then was not liquid, not bile, but a voice, hundreds of voices, all crying at once, tearing free from his chest in a shriek that rattled the glassware and extinguished half the candles. When silence finally returned, the master lay still upon the floor, eyes wide, mouth frozen in a scream that would never end. His body twitched once, then stiffened, as though every sin had clawed its way out of him and left nothing behind. The feast continued without him. The candles burned lower, guttering in their sockets. The guests remained seated, trembling, unable to rise, unable to flee. For each of them knew their cups too had been poured. Their plates too had been marked, and though no one spoke her name, each bite carried it bitter and undeniable, until they could taste nothing else. When the house was finally abandoned, it did not fall silent. Silence would have been mercy. Instead, it filled with a scratching, gnawing chorus, a new congregation that required no blessing, no invitation. The rats came first by dozens, then by hundreds, pouring from the riverbanks, from the cellars, from the hidden cracks where the bricks had long begun to crumble. They came like a tide, their bodies slick and grey, their teeth clicking like the keys of some infernal organ. The grand dining hall, once a stage for chandeliers and velvet laughter, now became their altar. Bones still rested on the table, forgotten in the chaos of flight. Meat clung stubbornly to plates, bread lay torn and moulding, wine congealed into black syrup at the bottom of crystal goblets. The rats feasted with a fervour more honest than any nobleman's hunger. They tore through silk tablecloths, dragged scraps across the floor, gnawed until their muzzles dripped red with juices that were no longer fresh. But not all the bones belonged to animals. In the far corner, beneath the gaze of a portrait whose paint had already begun to peel, a skull grinned from beneath its shroud of hair. The rats crawled in and out of its gaping mouth, their tails sliding over hollow sockets, as though they had claimed it as their doorway. A rib cage, still wrapped in tatters of linen, rocked as the vermin burrowed through, stripping what sinew remained. The house had not been empty when it was abandoned. The house had kept its guests, locked inside its walls with Violet's lingering breath. At night the villagers swore they heard it. A banquet that had not ended, the scrape of claws echoing like cutlery, the squeaks rising like laughter, the crunch of tiny teeth against marrow. It was said that if you crept close enough to the windows, you could see them seated in perfect rows upon the long table, as though mimicking the feast they had consumed. Rats perched in chairs, rats hunched over platters, rats raising goblets with their paws, dipping their whiskers into the sludge that had once been wine. And sometimes the bodies twitched. It was never long, never more than a flicker, but it was enough. A finger curled where no life should have remained. A jaw moved as if forming a word, a chest heaved shallowly beneath its ruin of flesh. The rats would gather tighter then, crowding closer, their bodies shivering in unison as though feeding not on flesh, but on the very memory of pain. The air grew thick with their musk. It seeped into the curtains, into the wood, into the very stones of the foundation. Travellers who lodged too near the plantation complained of nightmares, dreams of being gnawed piece by piece, of teeth whispering across their bones, of eyes gleaming red in the dark. Some never woke, their throats found ragged as though chewed, though no rat dared remain in their rooms come morning. And in the heart of the hall, where the master had once raised his glass in triumph, the swarm always left a space, a chair untouched, a plate unspoiled, a goblet still half full with tar-like wine. It was as if they were waiting for the true guest to return and take her seat at their table. The portraits that lined the walls sagged under mildew, yet one detail never faded. Violet's reflection, faint but sharp, appeared in the glass of every frame, sometimes smiling, sometimes frowning, always watching. The villagers called it a curse, but curses can be avoided. What dwelled in that house was no curse. It was hunger. Hunger that did not end with death. Hunger that required no warmth, no prayer, no peace. The hunger of a house that remembered every scream fed within its walls, and the rats, loyal in their endless banquet, would not let that memory go. They thought the fire would cleanse it. That was the lie whispered in trembling voices when the villagers, sick of the scratching, sick of the whispers, gathered with torches and kerosene. They set the plantation ablaze, wood shrieking as flames climbed higher than the shutters had ever dared. The roof cracked, the beams groaned, and the night pulsed orange, painting the Mississippi with reflected blood. The rats did not flee. They poured from the windows, from the cellar doors, from beneath the floorboards, not escaping but swarming in circles as though guarding what remained within. Their bodies blackened in the fire, tails thrashing, squeals sharp as knives, until they became part of the smoke itself, carried upward in a column of writhing shadows. The villagers cheered at first, certain the curse was ending. certain that wood and flame would devour what prayers could not. But then the smoke changed. It did not rise in tatters, it did not scatter on the wind. It coiled thick and deliberate, twisting into shapes no fire had the right to make. From the heart of that column came laughter, low, brittle, unmistakably human. Children cried out, clutching their mothers. Men dropped their buckets and ran. For in the wavering plumes a figure stood, not whole, not flesh, but formed of shadow and cinder. Violet's face flickered there, carved from smoke, her eyes darker than the night sky, her lips curling in the same half-smile that had haunted their feasts. She did not speak with words. She spoke with the air itself, each villager's lungs filling with her presence. The smoke carried her hunger into their throats, leaving them coughing, gagging, tasting ashes that were not from wood. Bitter bread, burnt flesh, the memory of every lash, every chain, ground down into powder and pressed into their tongues. One by one they fell to their knees, not in worship, but in suffocation. The flames roared, but the sound of it was nothing compared to the whispers that slithered through the crowd. Whispers in Violet's voice, but multiplied, layered, a chorus of the drowned, the beaten, the starved. Did you think fire could end what chains began? The smoke spilled outward, crawling through streets, seeping beneath doors, wrapping around chimneys until the entire quarter smelled of burning bread and bitter herbs. Bakers cursed their ovens when their loaves rose black. Mothers wept as their milk soured in their breasts. Priests tried to bless the air, but every word of holy tongue twisted in their mouths, turning sour before it could escape. And in the kitchens of New Orleans, where pots boiled and knives struck wood, the cooks froze. They tasted her in the steam. They heard her in the hiss of oil. Violet had returned not in body but in breath. In every meal, every crumb, every swallow. They say the fire burned the house to ash, yet no one ever found its foundation. Some swore the cellar still yawned beneath the ruin, its stones cold and wet, as if untouched by flame. Some swore they saw smoke rise from it still, long after the last ember died. And others whispered that Violet had never been gone. She was in the kitchens, in the bread, in the smoke of every fire that dared to cook in a city built on chains. That if you ever tasted bitterness where there should have been sweetness, if you ever swallowed and felt a heaviness that did not belong, it was her hand stirring your pot. She did not need the house anymore. She did not need the table, the chairs, or the silverware. She had taken root in the mouths of the living, in their hunger, in their fear. And if you find yourself eating in New Orleans, and the food tastes wrong, not spoiled, not rotten, but wrong, then close your eyes and pray. Pray that her vengeance is not meant for you, because Violet's return was not a moment. It was forever.